My name is Seamus Drummond, and I am 72 years old. At my age, many of my peers are enjoying a well-deserved retirement surrounded by loving families. But my story is different. I always thought I raised my son the right way, demanding and strict. Now I have to wonder where I went wrong, since my own child wants me dead. Life in Tucson has never been easy for me. For 38 years, I worked as a civil engineer, designing bridges and buildings all over Arizona. Many of them are still standing today. I'm proud of that. It's ironic that I helped to build so many sturdy structures, and my own family now has no foundation to hold them up. My Clarissa died 8 years ago. Lung cancer took her in just 6 months. She was the only person who really understood me, tolerated my difficult temper, and knew how to calm my temper tantrums. We met at a coffee shop when I was 29. She worked as a junior high school teacher and had a softness that I had always lacked. Opposites attract, as they say. Alton was born 2 years after we were married. From childhood, he was a weak, sickly boy. I always thought strictness would build him into a man. Clarissa was always arguing with me, saying that I was putting too much pressure on the child, that not all children should be like their fathers. Seamus, you want to raise a copy of yourself, not help your son become himself, she said during our arguments. Maybe she was right. I demanded too much of Alton. Excellent grades, athletic achievement, a determination he never had. When he turned 15, I found him crying in his room because he had failed in a school competition. Real men don't cry, I told him then. They get up and try again. He looked at me with a long look I'll never forget. There was such deep resentment and alienation in his eyes that even I felt uncomfortable. I think that's when something broke between us. After high school, Alton didn't go to college, even though I insisted on an engineering degree. Instead, he took a job as a salesman at an electronics store, then moved to a call center. Now at 46, he works as a petty clerk for an insurance company. His paycheck is barely enough to cover the interest on the loans he racked up while trying to impress his now-wife Prudence. Ah, Prudence. That woman is a separate story. When Alton brought her to meet Clarissa and me 15 years ago, I knew right away that she wasn't the kind of woman looking for a quiet family life. In her 30s, Prudence had already had several careers, including stripping at a club on the outskirts of town. I'm not a prude, but it was obvious she was only interested in our family's financial situation. She has dyed hair, overly bright makeup, and a habit of licking her lips when she talks about money. Alton looks at her like a rabbit at a boa constrictor. Your son is a born businessman, she told me at our first meeting. Ekton, he could do a lot better if we had some startup capital. After that, they came to me for money at least 10 more times, either to start an online store or to invest in some dubious stocks. I lent them money a couple of times, but I never saw the money again, and all their business endeavors ended in failure. The stroke happened to me last year, 3 days before Thanksgiving. I remember making breakfast and suddenly the left side of my body went numb and the room started spinning. I woke up in the hospital. The doctor said I was lucky. The blow was not too strong. 2 weeks later, I was discharged, but the consequences remained. Sometimes my arm goes numb, and there was a slight limp. It was after the stroke that I noticed a change in Alton and Prudence's behavior. Suddenly, they started visiting me every weekend, bringing me groceries and asking me how I was feeling. Prudence even cooked me dinner, the first time I had ever met her in all the years I had known her. I was touched at first, thinking the illness had made them rethink our relationship. Papa, you should get more rest, Alton said with an unusual concern in his voice. Maybe we should talk about how to organize your care. Yes, Seamus, Prudence said. It's not safe for you to live alone in a house this big at your age. We could move in with you, help with the household. I politely declined their offer. My house was my fortress, and I wasn't about to let those two in on a permanent basis, especially since Prudence had already begun to notice how nice my antique clocks were and how much my collection of old coins might be worth. Then their visits became even more frequent. They began to come on weekdays, sometimes showing up unannounced. One day I came home from the store and found Prudence rummaging through my desk drawer where I kept my papers. I was looking for aspirin, she said, not even embarrassed. Alton began cautiously inquiring if I'd updated the will since Clarissa's death. Just want to make sure everything is in order, he explained. I'd heard that after Gordon's neighbor died, his relatives fought over the inheritance. I wouldn't want that to happen to your estate. I didn't bother to tell him that after my stroke, I'd actually updated my will, leaving most of the estate to my niece Tabitha, my brother's daughter. She was the only relative who visited me for nothing, with no hint of an inheritance. One day as I dozed in my chair, Prudence's voice from the kitchen woke me up. She was on the phone, thinking I was sound asleep. His doctor said that old people who have had a stroke have a high risk of having another one, she said quietly. And the second one is usually fatal. We just have to wait. Nature will do its own thing. I froze, trying to breathe steady so she wouldn't notice I was awake. Assuraninorum. He changed his will, I'm sure, she continued. There's some record of Tabitha in his papers. It could ruin all our plans. Alton thinks we should move faster. I felt a chill run through my body. My own family had discussed my death as a welcome event. I remembered all the times Prudence had insisted that I take the medicine out of her hands, even though I was perfectly capable of doing it myself. All the times I had felt inexplicably weak and drowsy after their visits. When they left that day, I sat in the silence of my house for a long time. The sun was setting outside the window, coloring the desolate Tucson landscape with red-orange tones. I stared at the picture of Clarissa standing on the mantelpiece. She was smiling her soft smile, and I felt like she wanted to tell me something. "What am I supposed to do, Clarissa?" I asked the empty room. For the first time in years, I felt real fear. Not for my own life. At my age, death no longer seemed such a terrible end. I was afraid that my own son, flesh and blood, might want me dead, that I had raised a man capable of such a thing. The next day, I went to the bank and opened a new safe deposit box where I moved all the important documents. Then I went to the drugstore and bought food poison test strips. At home, I took out the old tape recorder I used to use for work notes. I needed proof. I had to know exactly what Alton and Prudence were up to before I could take any action. Suspicion wasn't enough. I needed certainty. 2 days later, I had a chance to test my hunch. Alton called and said that he and Prudence were coming over to bring me lunch. I agreed, but when they arrived and were distracted by the conversation, I discreetly took samples of the food for testing. The test showed the presence of sleeping pills in the tea Prudence had made. They were really trying to drug me, probably hoping it would trigger another stroke. I didn't give the appearance of knowing of their plans, but discreetly poured the tea into the flower pot when they weren't looking. That evening, after they left, I found the strength to call Tabitha and tell her of my suspicions. She suggested I go to the police immediately, but I declined. "I need hard evidence," I explained to her. "Otherwise, it would just be the old man's word against his son's." I couldn't stop thinking about where our relationship had gotten to. Where and when had I taken a wrong turn? Perhaps if I'd been a gentler father, if I'd praised Alton more often, if I hadn't compared him to myself constantly. But now it was too late for regrets. A week later, I installed hidden cameras in the house. One in the living room, one in the kitchen, one in the study where important documents were kept. I wasn't sure what their next move would be, thinking maybe they'd decide to just wait for nature to take its course, as Prudence had said on the phone. But that same night, I overheard another of their conversations. They were in the garage, thinking I was taking an afternoon nap. I heard Alton's voice, unaccustomedly firm and determined. "We can't wait any longer," he was saying. "What if he lives another 10 years? By then we'd be up to our necks in debt, unable to pay the mortgage. We have to act." "Are you sure?" Prudence sounded worried. "This isn't just slipping sleeping pills anymore. It's—" "I know what it is," Alton interrupted her, "but it's his own fault. All my life he's been controlling me, telling me I was nothing, that I could never be as successful as him. Now he can finally put his family to good use." I froze at the door leading to the garage, barely breathing. It wasn't enough for my son to slip me sleeping pills. He was planning something more drastic. In that moment, I realized I had to be even more careful. Later that evening, watching the CCTV footage, I saw them discussing my will while I was in the garden. Prudence was going through papers in a desk drawer I had purposely left unlocked, with a fake will inside. "Sure. It says here that the house and all the savings go to Alton," she said, running her eyes over the document. "That's good, but I don't like the fact that he wants to leave some of the shares to his niece." "Forget the stock," Alton said. "The main thing is the house and the accounts. That's enough to start a new life." I could see their faces close up on the tape, The greedy gleam in Prudence's eyes, the determined look on Alton's face. They looked like predators who had cornered their prey and were ready for the final rush. The next morning, watching the footage from the camera in the garage, I saw something that made me go cold. Alton was tinkering with the brake system of my car, the old Buick I'd driven for the past 15 years. He tinkered with something, then carefully wiped his hands and closed the hood. They decided not to wait for natural death or another stroke. They decided to speed up the process by giving me an accident. The road from my house goes through hilly terrain, and if the brakes failed on one of the steep descents, now I knew for sure, my own son wanted to kill me. I had all the evidence. I could go to the police right now, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride. I didn't want anyone to know what kind of snake I'd raised. Or maybe I just wanted to teach them a lesson in a more creative way. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the monitor with a frozen shot of Alton fiddling with my car's brakes. A plan began to form in my head, a plan that would not only allow me to survive, but to see the true faces of these two when they thought their scheme had succeeded. The next day, I called my old colleague Brody Tate. We had worked together on several projects before he started his own security firm. Even though we're both in our 70s, Brody still has his finger on the pulse of the latest technology. I figured he was the right person to help me with the cameras. "What's your problem, old man?" he asked after hearing my request for a meeting. "Are you being robbed?" "You could say that," I answered evasively. "I'll explain everything." Brody showed up 2 hours later with a small suitcase. I offered him coffee and we settled on the veranda where no one could overhear us. "My son and his wife are trying to kill me," I said without preamble. Brody choked on his coffee and coughed. "I'm sorry, what?" I told him everything. The strange behavior of Alton and Prudence after the stroke, the overheard conversations, the sleeping pills in the tea. With every word, my old friend's face grew darker and darker. "Seamus, this is a serious accusation. Are you sure?" "That's why we need cameras. I want to gather hard evidence." He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I can set up mini cameras in the main rooms and the garage. They'll transmit a signal to your computer, and you can set them to record when motion is detected. But Seamus, if your suspicions are correct, you need to go to the police." "Proof first," I said firmly. "No one's going to believe an old man who accuses his own son of attempted murder without hard evidence." Brody frowned but nodded. "All right, but you have to promise me you'll be careful. And as soon as you get proof, you'll go straight to the police." I agreed. Though even then, another plan began to form in my head. A plan that would allow me to see their real faces when they thought they'd succeeded. Setting up the cameras took about 3 hours. Brody placed 5 devices in strategic locations: the living room, kitchen, hallway, my bedroom, and the garage. The cameras were tiny, about the size of a button, and disguised as interior elements. In the living room, it was hiding in the spine of a book on a shelf, in the kitchen in the clock, in the hallway in the light switch, in the bedroom in the frame of a photograph, and in the garage in the electrical box. "All the records will be stored on this secure server," Brody explained, pointing to a small device we'd hidden in the basement. "You can connect to it from your laptop. Here's the program. It's very easy to use." He showed me how to view the recordings and set up motion notifications. As we fiddled with the tech, I felt strangely calm. Now that I had taken action, fear was replaced by cold determination. "Thanks, man," I said, shaking Brody's hand. "I owe you one." "Just be careful," he said again, "and keep me in the loop. If anything goes wrong, call me any time of day or night." After he left, I checked the operation of each camera, made sure they were really invisible, and waited. It didn't take long. Alton and Prudence arrived the next day, Saturday. They brought groceries and offered to cook dinner. I politely agreed and retired to my bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar so I could hear what they were talking about. Simultaneously, I watched them through the kitchen camera from my laptop screen. While Prudence chopped vegetables for the salad, Alton opened the cabinet where I kept the medication. He thought I couldn't see as he pulled out the vial of my blood pressure pills, dumped them out, and replaced them with some others very similar in appearance. His hands were shaking slightly, but his face remained calm. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Prudence asked in a whisper, looking back at my bedroom door. "Dr. Eames said those pills would cause his blood pressure to plummet. With his medical history, that could trigger another stroke, and the second one is usually fatal," Alton answered. I caught my breath. Dr. Eames was my primary care physician. Was he involved in this too? But then I remembered that Alton worked for the insurance company that serviced Eames's clinic. He probably had access to my medical records and just made up the doctor's recommendation. What if it doesn't work? Prudence continued, looking around nervously. Then there's Plan B, Alton said quietly, nodding toward the window where my car could be seen. I felt a chill run down my spine. Plan B obviously included my car. I decided to play my part to the end. Getting out of bed, I yawned noisily and headed to the kitchen as if I had just woken up. Smells good, I said, smiling. What's for dinner? Alton flinched and quickly closed the medicine cabinet. Prudence smiled strainedly. Lasagna, your favorite, she sang out. It'll be ready in 20 minutes. At dinner, they were unusually attentive. Alton even told a couple of funny stories from work, something he hadn't done in years. Prudence gave me a refill and kept asking if I needed anything else. When it was time for my evening pills, Alton brought them in a glass of water. I took the pill, put it in my mouth, and drank the water. But I didn't swallow it. I hid it under my tongue. When they turned away, I discreetly spit it out into a napkin and hid it in my pocket. Later, I threw all the pills down the toilet and replaced them with new ones from a sealed package I kept in a stash in my bedroom. After dinner, Alton offered to wash my car. It looks a little dusty, he said. I'll have it cleaned up in no time. Ero. No need, son, I replied. It's supposed to rain tomorrow, and it'll get dirty anyway. No, I don't mind, he insisted. You've done so much for me. Let me help a little. I reluctantly agreed, knowing that the camera in the garage would record all his actions. While Alton worked on the car, Prudence entertained me with a conversation about her new job at the boutique. She talked nonstop, clearly trying to keep me from going into the garage to check on her husband. Later, when they left, I immediately reviewed the camera footage in the garage. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. Alton hadn't washed the car. Instead, he had opened the hood and was doing something to the brake system. I zoomed in and clearly saw him notching the brake hose enough that it would hold for a short trip, but burst when I pressed down hard on the pedal. My hands trembled. It was one thing to suspect, and quite another to see with your own eyes your child preparing your death. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Memories flashed through my mind. Alton at 5, proudly showing me his drawing. Alton at 10, crying after I scolded him for a bad grade. Alton at 16, withdrawn and aloof, avoiding my gaze. Where did I go wrong? When had my son's love and respect turned to such fierce hatred? I remembered all those times when I had been too strict, when I had demanded the impossible, when I had compared him to myself and found him unworthy. Maybe I had created this monster with my own hands, but now was not the time for regrets. I needed to act. I called Tabitha and asked her to come over without giving any reason. She arrived an hour later, worried and anxious. What's wrong, Uncle Seamus? She asked, seeing the look on my face. I silently showed her the tapes. Her face grew paler and paler with each passing minute. Oh my God, she whispered when the tape ended. We need to call the police immediately. No, I said firmly. I have another plan. What other plan? They're trying to kill you. I know they are, and I want them to get what they deserve, but not just jail time. I want them to feel the horror of their actions. I told Tabitha my idea. She objected for a long time, saying it was too risky, but finally gave in when she saw the determination in my eyes. Okay, she sighed, but I'll be there every step of the way, and at the slightest risk, we cancel the whole thing and call the police. I agreed to this compromise. We spent several hours working out the details of the plan. Tabitha, who worked as a special effects artist in movies, knew how to make everything believable. The next morning I called Alton. Son, I said in a cheerful voice, I want to go to the bank, but the car's acting funny. Could you come over and take a look? Sure, Dad, he said, and I could almost physically feel his excitement. I'll be there in half an hour. When he arrived, I showed him the car, complaining about some ghostly noise in the engine. Alton pretended to scrutinize the engine. I don't see anything wrong, he said at last. Probably just old plugs. I can replace them next week. Can the car be used now? I asked with feigned concern. I really need to go to the bank today. I think so, he said, and I caught a glint of gloating in his eyes. Just don't drive, okay? Old cars need careful handling. Thanks, son. I patted him on the shoulder. You were always attentive to your old man. After he left, I immediately called Tabitha. The plan was in motion. Now the preparations had to be finalized. I went down to the garage, taking my tools with me. Despite my age, I was still good at mechanics. Carefully inspecting the brake system, I found a cut on the hose, just like the one in the video. I replaced the damaged hose with a new one that I had purchased in advance, spending about an hour on the job. Then thoroughly tested the brakes, making sure they worked perfectly. The car was now safe, but Alton didn't know that. He thought I was driving a car with faulty brakes that would fail on the first steep downhill. Well, it was time to show him what it was like to think your plan had worked. That evening, Tabitha arrived with the necessary props. She brought theatrical makeup, fake blood, and a few other special effects that would make the staging of the accident as believable as possible. Sebum, "Are you sure you want to go all the way?" she asked, laying out her supplies. "Absolutely," I nodded. "They have to feel like their plan worked. They should start celebrating their victory. And then I'll show up and show them how deeply they've been misguided." Tabitha sighed but didn't argue. She knew that once I made a decision, it was impossible to change my mind. It was a quality that made me a successful engineer, but perhaps not the best father. We rehearsed all night. I was to stage an accident on a winding road outside of town, where my car supposedly went off the highway due to brake failure. Tabitha would make it look like I went through the windshield. We'll prepare enough evidence for the police and rescue workers to search for the body in the crevice under the road. In the meantime, I'll be watching Alton and Prudence for reactions. "What if they don't believe it?" Tabitha asked. "What if they suspect a trick?" "They will," I said confidently. "They are so eager for my death and my inheritance that they will gladly believe in the success of their plan." When all the details were worked out, I went to bed. Despite the seriousness of the situation, I felt strangely elated. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive, full of energy and determination. Perhaps it was wrong to have such feelings, planning a cruel lesson for my own son. But after everything I'd learned, after seeing his true face, something in me had changed. The anger and pain of betrayal transformed into a cold, calculating resolve. I felt no hatred for Alton and Prudence, only deep disappointment and a desire to teach them a lesson they would remember for the rest of their lives. A lesson that some crimes do not go unpunished, even if it seems otherwise at first. In the morning, I checked my plan one last time. Everything was in place. All that remained was to execute it and see how my loving relatives would react when they believed their plan had worked. And then would come the moment of truth, the moment when I would see their real faces. I got behind the wheel of my Buick, started the engine, and drove out of the yard. It was time. I parked the car on the side of the deserted road leading to Sabino Canyon. The location was perfect for my plan. A steep curve, a bluff, and the occasional passing car. The canyon was far enough away from the city to avoid attracting casual witnesses, but it was also a known place where accidents were not uncommon. Tabitha arrived 20 minutes later in her pickup truck, loaded with everything she needed. She looked tense but determined. "Are you still sure you want to do this?" she asked as she unloaded the boxes of props. "More than sure," I replied, helping her. "My charm. They need to feel like their plan worked before I give them a real surprise." We worked quickly and methodically. Tabitha, using her skills as a special effects artist, smashed the windshield of my car in a special way to make it look like I flew out through it. We then pushed the car closer to the edge of the cliff, but in such a way that it didn't fall completely. We scattered around shards of glass, a few of my personal belongings, my wallet, my glasses, a bloody handkerchief. Tabitha had professionally applied fake blood to the driver's seat, steering wheel, and broken glass. "Now for the most important part," she said, pulling a mannequin doll out of the trunk of her pickup truck. The mannequin was about my height and build, dressed in my old clothes. Tabitha had used her makeup skills to give his face some resemblance to me, though it was still impossible to see from a distance. We set it up as if the body had fallen into a crevasse and gotten stuck between rocks, but deep enough that extraction would require special equipment. "Are you sure this is going to work?" I asked, looking at the result of our labors. "The search and rescue team won't come down right away," Tabitha explained. "They'll assess the situation first, call for reinforcements. That will take time. By the time they decide to go down for the body, you won't be on the missing list, because you'll be at your own wake. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. I knew she didn't like my plan, but she was helping out of respect for my feelings and the realization that I'd still do it with or without her help. One last touch, Tabitha said as she attached a small radio transmitter to the mannequin. It's for credibility in case the rescuers have a thermal imager. The transmitter emitted a faint heat, similar to the cooling of the human body. I marveled at her foresight. All these years I had thought her profession was frivolous, but now I saw how deeply she knew her business. Now we need to make an anonymous call to the emergency services, Tabitha said, pulling out a disposable cell phone. I'll tell them I was driving by and saw the wrecked car. I'll say I didn't stop to see if there were any survivors because I was in a hurry. That would be enough for them to send out a patrol. I nodded, watching her make the call. Her voice sounded scared and worried, perfect acting. When she finished, she smashed the phone and tossed the shards into the crevice. Now we have to leave, she said. The police and rescue teams will be here in about 30 minutes. I'll take you to my country house, and from there, you can watch the events unfold. We got into her pickup truck and drove off. I looked back at the stage accident. It looked realistic enough from the outside. My heart was pounding like crazy, not from fear, but from a strange excitement. For the first time in years, I felt alive, active, not just living out my days. Tabitha's suburban home was a 20-minute drive from the accident site, in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Tucson. It was a modest one-story house with a small lot, surrounded by a tall fence, the perfect hideaway. You can stay here as long as you need to, Tabitha said, showing me to my room. No one knows about this place, not even my friends. I bought it as a studio for my projects. I thanked her for her help, even though I realized that a simple thank you couldn't express all of my appreciation. Tabitha was the only person I could trust in this situation. We set up the laptop and connected it to the internet. Now we had to wait for the news. Tabitha set up alerts on local news sites and the police wave so we could follow the developments. The first report of the accident came in 2 hours later. A short note on the local news site: a wrecked vehicle was found on Sabino Canyon Road. Search and rescue operation underway. By late afternoon, the news had grown in detail. It was already mentioned that the car belonged to an elderly Tucson resident and that there is reason to believe the driver died thrown through the windshield. The search for the body continued. I knew that the police had already contacted Alton as my next of kin. Indeed, Tabitha soon received a call from her friend who works at the police station. They have notified her son, she said, ending the call. He and his wife have come to identify the car. A rescue team is trying to reach the body in the crevice. But due to darkness, the operation is likely to be postponed till morning. That's fine, I nodded. Sunam. That gives us time to observe their reaction. Tabitha gave me a long look. Do you really want to know how your son will react to the news of your death? I felt a slight prick of conscience, but quickly suppressed it. He tried to kill me, Tabitha. I have a right to know if he'll even pretend to grieve. She didn't argue, instead pulled a small camera from her bag. I can drive to your house and set this up in the car across the street. A camera with a good zoom and night vision will be able to watch what's going on. I agreed, and Tabitha drove off. She returned 2 hours later, smiling triumphantly. It's all set, she said, plugging the camera into the laptop. And I got here just in time. Watch. On the screen, I saw my house. Alton's car was parked out front, and he and Prudence were coming out of the door. Even through the camera, I could see that they didn't look grief-stricken. Alton was saying something, gesturing vigorously, and Prudence was fixing her hair as if she were going to a party, not just learning of her father-in-law's death. I felt a cold rage growing inside. Well, at least I had confirmation of my suspicions. They weren't in the least bit grieving. Any sound? I asked Tabitha. Unfortunately, no, she shook her head. We're too far away. But I can try to read lips if you want. No need, I waved my hand. I can see enough as it is. We watched as Alton and Prudence entered the house. After a while, the lights came on in the windows, and we could see their silhouettes moving around the living room. They clearly felt at home. My house had already become their home in their minds. An hour later, several more cars pulled up to the house. People got out of them. Friends of Alton and Prudence, I assumed. They were carrying bags that looked like grocery bags and bottles of alcohol. Are they throwing a party? I asked incredulously. The day they found out I was dead? Tabitha squeezed my hand. I'm so sorry, Uncle. I shook my head, feeling something inside finally snap. The last remnants of my fatherly feelings for Alton were dying watching this scene. My own son was celebrating my death. Over the next hour, several more cars pulled up to the house. With each new guest, it became more and more obvious. This was not a morning gathering, but a real party. Through the windows, we could see people with glasses, laughing and talking. At one point, Alton even turned on some music. I recognized the rhythm without even hearing the sound. Disgusting, Tabitha whispered. I didn't say a word. Words were unnecessary. The picture spoke for itself. Toward midnight, several guests came out of the house, clearly tipsy. They hesitantly made their way to their cars and drove away. The others seemed to have stayed the night. What now? Tabitha asked, turning off the camera as the house lights went out. Now we wait for morning, I answered. Tomorrow the police will officially announce that they found the body. And then the fun will begin. In the morning, Tabitha and I woke up early. The first thing we did was to check the news as expected. There was a report that the rescue team had found a body in the crevasse, and it belonged to a well-known local engineer, Seamus Drummond, 72 years old. Police have tentatively classified the accident as an accident caused by brake failure. Everything's going according to plan, I said, sipping the coffee Tabitha had made for breakfast. Now we just need to find out when the funeral will be. Tabitha nodded and made some calls. An hour later, we had the information. Alton was organizing a cremation for the day after tomorrow, and there was to be a wake at my house tonight. A wake, I grinned. A continuation of last night's party, I suppose. What are you going to do? Show up at the wake, of course, I shrugged, as if that was the most obvious answer. But first I need to stop by the bank and my lawyer's office. I want to make sure all my paperwork is in order before I expose these two. Tabitha drove me to the bank, where I took all the important documents from the safe deposit box. The real will, the certificate of title to the house, the account statements. Then we visited my lawyer, Mr. Howard Purchagrew, who was extremely surprised to see me alive. Seamus! He exclaimed, almost dropping his glasses. But the news said, I know, Howard. I gestured him to stop. It's a long story, and I'll explain it later. Right now, I need your help with something else. I told him an abridged version of the events, omitting the details about Alton trying to kill me. Instead, I told him that I wanted to teach my son a lesson because of his irresponsible attitude toward my property. Howard was confused but agreed to help, especially when I explained that I would go to the police later with full information. I need you to be at the wake today, I said. Bring all the inheritance papers with you. When I show up, I want you to have official confirmation that I'm the sole owner of the entire estate. Howard reluctantly agreed, though I could tell by the look on his face that he thought my plan was crazy. But he'd been my lawyer for 30 years and was used to my eccentric decisions. Back at Tabitha's house, we began to get ready for the evening. She helped me pick out the right clothes, a sleek black suit that I usually wore to my friends' funerals. Ironic, Tabitha grinned. A funeral suit for your own wake. By 6 p.m., everything was ready. Tabitha drove me to the house and left me around the corner. I was to show up in the middle of the wake when all the guests had already gathered. Using the camera, we watched as people arrived at my house, mostly friends of Alton and Prudence, a few neighbors who seemed to be genuinely grieving, and finally my lawyer, Howard. I noticed that Prudence had changed into one of her most expensive outfits. She hadn't even bothered to wear something black, opting instead for a bright red dress. Alton, too, looked obscenely animated for a man who had just lost his father. Bastards, Tabitha whispered, watching them. I watched with cold determination. An hour later, when all the guests had gathered, I saw Alton raise his glass, clearly making a toast. I could tell from his smile that it wasn't a mournful toast to his father. It's time, I said to Tabitha. She hugged me tightly. Be careful, I'll be around if you need help. I nodded, took a deep breath, and headed toward my house. With each step, I could feel my resolve growing. They wanted me dead? Well, now they would see what it was like to dance on the grave of someone who wasn't dead yet. I stood on the opposite side of the street watching my house. I've had my share of strange moments in my 72 years of life, but nothing compares to watching my own wake. Through the large living room windows, I could see people gathered in groups, talking, drinking, and laughing. None of them looked particularly sad. My feet carried me closer on their own. I stopped at a neighbor's house, hidden behind a hedge where I could see and hear what was going on. Some of the guests were out in the backyard. The weather was warm in Tucson, and Prudence had apparently decided to have a barbecue. My barbecue, in my backyard, with money they already thought was theirs. I recognized some of the guests, Alton's colleagues from the insurance company, a few of Prudence's friends from her boutique. There were neighbors too, the Donnellys and old Norman Craig, who, by the look on their faces, were uncomfortable in the midst of all the fun. They, unlike the others, had really come to honor old Seamus. My gaze found Alton. He was standing at the grill with a glass of whiskey, my best whiskey, the one I kept for special occasions. Well, I guess it was a special occasion for him. Prudence fluttered between the guests in her brightly colored dress, too short and revealing for a wake. She laughed, tilting her head, and every time she passed Alton, she put her hand possessively on his shoulder. I felt a heaviness in my chest. Not from grief or disappointment, I'd long ago accepted what my son had become. Rather from the realization of how quickly people can turn the page. To Alton and Prudence, I was already a thing of the past, an erased record, useful only as the asset they hoped to have. It was a good thing I'd had time to change my will after my stroke. The new version left Alton only a token amount of $1 enough so that he couldn't challenge the document on the grounds that it had been forgotten to include. Everything else went to Tabitha and a few charitable organizations. I listened to the conversations. The sounds of the party echoed down the quiet street, and you could make out individual phrases if you wanted to, especially when someone stepped out onto the porch or backyard. "We can finally pay off our loans," Alton's voice came to me. "And move out of here," Prudence said. "I hate this old house, too many memories. We'll sell it and buy something modern on the north side of town." I couldn't help but chuckle. They didn't know yet that they wouldn't get the house or the money. I wonder what they'll say when they find out the truth. The party was gaining momentum. Someone turned up the music, loud and totally inappropriate for a wake. I saw several guests start dancing in the backyard. Prudence joined them, wriggling in her red dress to the rhythmic tune. I decided to get closer. Going around the house, I snuck through the back gate into the garden where Clarissa had once grown roses. There was only a dry bush there now. I hadn't taken care of the flowers since her death. Sheltering behind it, I could hear the conversations in the yard much more clearly. "Has the will been probated yet?" someone asked Alton. "Yes, it's all in accordance with the law," he answered, trying to make his voice sound mournful, but not succeeding very well. My father left everything to me as sole heir." Liar. I wanted to come out right now and tell him the truth, but I held back. The moment hadn't come yet. "It must be hard to lose a father," Alton continued. I recognized him, Drake Hopkins, my son's colleague from the insurance company. "Sure," Alton sighed with feigned sadness. But my father and I had grown closer lately. He realized he needed help, especially after his stroke. I'm glad I was able to support him in the last few months. I almost laughed out loud. What an actor to be missing. He really supported me, right into my grave. "I always said you were a wonderful son," Prudence interjected, approaching them with a new glass of wine. "Seamus was very grateful to you, I know." She put her hand on Alton's shoulder and squeezed it gently. I saw the falseness in her every gesture, heard it in every word. "When is the cremation?" Drake asked. "Tomorrow," Alton answered. "We decided not to delay. Father never liked long ceremonies." It was true, I really hated pompous events and long farewells. But what they were doing now was disgusting. It wasn't a wake, it was a celebration of deliverance. "What about the house?" Drake asked. "Are you going to stay here?" "No, of course not," Prudence snorted. "We'll sell it as soon as possible. It's an old people's home, not ours." "Do you have any plans for where you're going?" Drake was obviously trying to make small talk, unaware of its true implications. "I've looked at a few places in Rancho Sinaloa," Prudence said excitedly. "They have beautiful new homes with pools and landscaping, and the neighborhood is upscale. I knew the neighborhood, one of the most expensive in Tucson. Certainly not affordable for an insurance clerk and a boutique saleswoman. But with the money they were hoping to get from the sale of my house and my savings, it would be possible. That sounds wonderful, Drake said. When are you moving? As soon as the inheritance formalities are settled, said Alton. Hopefully within a month. My father left everything in perfect order, so there shouldn't be any problems. They continued to discuss their plans, and I listened, feeling a cold rage growing inside. They didn't even try to hide their impatience, their eagerness to start spending my money. The party went on and the guests were gradually getting drunker. The conversations grew louder, the laughter more licentious. I saw my lawyer Howard standing apart from the fun, clearly feeling out of place. He knew what was really going on, and his face was a mixture of bewilderment and disapproval. At one point, Prudence, who had already had a lot to drink, began to openly discuss with her friends what she was going to do with my house before selling it. Everything in here needs to be changed, she said as she looked around the living room. This furniture is a real antique, and not in a good way. And those old pictures on the walls, God, who needs all those memories? She walked over to the mantelpiece where Clarissa's picture stood and unceremoniously slid it aside to set her glass down. I'll start packing everything up tomorrow, she continued. The old stuff to charity, the rest to the dump. One of her friends, a woman with platinum-dyed hair I didn't know, glanced at Clarissa's picture. Who's that? Your mother-in-law? Yes, she died a few years ago, Prudence answered carelessly. Alton said she was much better than her husband, not so feisty and controlling. At that moment, a wave of anger came over me. They could be planning my death, they could be happy about my accident, but insulting Clarissa's memory was out of line. I had to take a few deep breaths to calm down. It wasn't time to show my face yet. There was more to see, more to hear. I moved closer to the house, taking cover behind a large hibiscus bush. From there, I could peer out the living room window, where the bulk of the guests were gathered. Alton stood in the center of the room, surrounded by his colleagues. He was telling some story, gesticulating vigorously, and everyone was laughing. I couldn't hear what he was talking about, but I could tell from the expression on his face that it was clearly not a touching memory of his father. Suddenly, Alton raised his glass, calling everyone to attention. The guests gradually fell silent. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, he began, and his voice reached me through the ajar window. My father was a complicated man. A chuckle rippled through the room. But he lived a long life, Alton continued, and now he's finally at peace. Thanks to your effort, I added mentally. I propose a toast. Alton raised his glass even higher. To new beginnings and freedom from the past. To new beginnings. The guests joined in, raising their glasses. I saw the triumphant smile on Alton's face as he took a sip. It was a toast not to my memory, but to his victory, his liberation. A toast to my death. Prudence walked over to him and wrapped her arms around his neck, whispering something in his ear. Alton laughed and kissed her. They looked happy, carefree, as if all their problems were in the past. As if killing their own father was just an unpleasant but necessary task that they had successfully accomplished. The party went on, and I watched my house, the place where I had lived most of my life, where I had raised my son, where I had been happy with Clarissa, turn into an arena for a celebration of my death. At one point, Prudence turned the music up louder, and several couples started dancing right in the living room, pushing furniture against the walls. I watched them hit and move things that to me were full of memories. The table Clarissa and I had bought at the antique store, the table lamp she loved so much, the photographs of our life together. To them, it was all just old junk that they would soon get rid of. I noticed that my attorney Howard had stepped aside and was on the phone. I could tell by the concerned look on his face that he was probably in touch with Tabitha, checking to make sure everything was going according to plan. They had agreed that I would show up at a certain time when the party was in full swing. The clock read almost 9 p.m. The moment of truth would soon arrive. I walked around the house once more, listening to the conversations. Everywhere I could hear Alton and Prudence discussing their plans for my property, how they would sell the house, how they would spend the money, how they would start a new life. Not a word of regret, not a single kind memory of me. As I walked back to the hedge, I saw Tabitha, who was discreetly watching from across the street. She noticed me and signaled that she was ready. Howard was ready too. He was standing in the corner of the living room with a folder of documents, waiting for me to appear. At that moment, I heard Alton call everyone to attention again. Friends, his voice sounded a little stiff from the drink. I have one more thing to say. Today, we not only say goodbye to the past, but we also celebrate the future. Prudence and I have long dreamed of a better life, and now, thanks to our inheritance, he didn't finish his sentence. Prudence elbowed him, obviously thinking he was being too frank. But it was too late. Everyone knew what he was talking about. Anyway, Alton tried to correct himself. Life goes on, and we'd like to invite you all to a housewarming party when we move into our new home in Rancho Sinaloa. The guests applauded, raising their glasses. Some of them, however, looked embarrassed. Even to them, it was obvious that it was at least unseemly to celebrate an inheritance so openly at the wake of a dead relative. I felt it was time. Time to put an end to this farce. Time to show Alton and Prudence that their plan had failed. That one could only dance on a grave when one was certain that its occupant was truly dead. I took a deep breath, adjusted my tie, and headed for the front door of my house. To the house that was still mine, and that would never belong to those two creeps. With each step, I could feel the determination growing in me. There was no more pain or frustration, just the cold, calm certainty that I was doing the right thing, the right and necessary thing. I stepped up onto the porch and put my hand on the doorknob. There was laughter, music, and clinking glasses outside the door, the sounds of a celebration that was about to turn into a nightmare for its organizers. I opened the door and stepped into my house. I stepped into my house and stood in the doorway for a moment. The music was blaring. People were talking, laughing, drinking, a typical party in full swing. No one noticed my appearance at first. I looked around the living room, noting the mess they'd already made of my house. Overturned bottles, stains on the carpet, shifting furniture. Someone had even hung a poster on the wall that read, "Onward to a New Life," clearly not the most appropriate slogan for a wake. The first person to notice me was Norman Craig, my old neighbor. He was standing at the bar sipping whiskey when our gazes met. His eyes widened, and the glass slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. The sound caught the attention of those around us, and gradually, like a wave, a silence swept through the room. People turned in my direction, their faces alternating between bewilderment, shock, and fright. "Good evening," I said into the ringing silence. "I hope I'm not late for my own wake." The music continued to play, but otherwise the house was completely silent. I took a few steps forward, entering the center of the room. The people parted before me like the waters of the Red Sea before Moses, with expressions of such unconcealed horror as if they had seen a real ghost. And then I saw Alton. He was standing by the fireplace with a glass in his hand, and his face was as white as chalk. Prudence froze beside him, her mouth open in a silent scream. She clutched at her husband's hand with such force that her knuckles turned white. "What? What? How?" Alton mumbled, unable to formulate a question. I walked slowly toward him, stopping at arm's length. "Surprised, son?" I asked quietly, but in the absolute silence, my voice was audible to everyone. "Didn't expect to see me alive?" Alton opened his mouth and closed it like a beached fish. His eyes darted frantically around the room, as if searching for an explanation or an escape route. "But," the police said, "they found the body," he whispered at last. "Oh yes, a body," I nodded. "You see, there really was a body in the crevice. A mannequin with very good makeup. The rescuers, in the dark, didn't go down to get him, and in the morning, when they were about to do so, he wasn't there. Strange, isn't it?" Prudence started to back away slowly, but I stopped her with a glance. "Take your time, dear sister-in-law," I said. The evening was just beginning. I looked around the room. The guests stood frozen in mute shock. Some of them seemed to be beginning to realize that something very bad was going on here, and reached for the exit. "Everyone, please stay." My voice sounded suddenly loud and commanding. "I have something to show and tell you, something that concerns each of you who have come today to honor my memory." I nodded to Howard, and he pulled a laptop computer out of his bag. He quickly plugged it into the TV hanging on the wall, the state-of-the-art equipment I'd installed at Clarissa's insistence shortly before she died. "What are you doing?" Alton finally found his voice. He tried to make his tone indignant, but it came out pathetic and frightened. "How could you make such a spectacle of yourself? We all thought you were dead. We were grieving." "Grieved?" I raised an eyebrow. Interesting definition for a party with music and dancing. An unusual way to express grief. I turned to the other guests. Let me tell you an entertaining story. A story of father and son, of greed and betrayal. Alton jerked as if he was going to stop me, but froze when the first video appeared on the TV screen. He was in my garage manipulating the brakes on the car. After my stroke, I continued as the video played silently, showing all of Alton's actions in detail. My son and his wife decided that I had lived too long, that my estate would benefit them more if I died, so they decided to help nature. I nodded to Howard and he switched to the next clip. Prudence slipping something into my medication. First it was sleeping pills, I explained. Then some powerful blood pressure meds, all in the hope of inducing another fatal stroke. The next video was of Alton and Prudence in my office, rummaging through papers and discussing how they would spend my money after I died. When slow methods didn't work, I continued, it was time for more drastic action. Alton reappeared on the screen, cutting the brake hose in my car. The room erupted in cries of horror and disgust. Some of the guests scrambled for the exit, unable to hear or see it anymore. "Make it stop," Prudence shrieked. "He's making it up. It's a montage. He's trying to slander us." I turned to her calmly. "A montage? Really? Why don't you tell everyone what you were talking about on the phone the day you thought I was asleep? About how nature will do it all on its own and how you need to act faster?" Prudence's face contorted with rage and fear. She grabbed a glass from the table and threw it at the television, but missed. It smashed against the wall, leaving a red wine stain on the wallpaper. "It's all his fault," she shouted, pointing at me. "He's been bullying Alton his whole life, controlled his every move, never gave him a chance." Alton stood with his head down, unable to look at me, at the guests, or at the television screen, where the images of their crime kept changing. "I knew you hated me, son," I said quietly, "but I never thought it would go this far." The guests began to leave the house in a hurry. No one wanted to remain a witness to this terrible family drama. Norman Craig, as he passed me, stopped for a moment and put his hand on my shoulder in a gesture of support. Then he too disappeared out the door. When the last guest left, it was just me, Alton, Prudence, and Howard, who stayed back, ready to intervene if things got out of hand. "Why?" I asked, looking at my son. "Why couldn't you just wait? I would have died sooner or later." Alton finally raised his head. In his eyes, I saw a strange mixture of fear, despair, and relief. Like a part of him was glad that it was finally over, that he didn't have to lie and pretend anymore. "You never understood," he said in a hoarse voice. "You never saw how I suffered all my life under your control, under your endless expectations. You always wanted me to be like you, but I could never conform." "And that's a reason to kill?" I shook my head. "I was a strict father, yes. Perhaps too strict, but I always wanted the best for you." "The best?" Alton grinned bitterly. "You wanted me to be a copy of you, an engineer like you, successful like you, strong like you. And when I didn't live up to your expectations, you looked at me with such disappointment, with such squeamishness." I wanted to object, but the words stuck in my throat. Because he was right about something. I was indeed disappointed in the man my son had grown up to be, but not because of his career or accomplishments, but because of his character. Weak, dependent, unable to take responsibility for his life. "You and I have both made mistakes," I finally said. "But murder isn't a mistake, son. It's a crime." "It was her!" Alton suddenly shouted, pointing at Prudence. "It was her idea. She said we needed money, that we were up to our necks in debt, that the only way out was to get the inheritance." Prudence recoiled from him like a leper. "Liar!" she hissed. "You're the one who suggested cutting the brakes. You said it would look like an accident. I only wanted him to die a natural death sooner." They stood across from each other, momentarily forgetting their unity in the face of exposure. Each thought only of how to save himself by shifting the blame to the other. I looked at them and felt not anger, but a deep, all-encompassing weariness. Those two weren't worth all the years I'd spent worrying about them, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong as a father. "The police are on their way," I said, breaking their bickering. "I called them before I came in here. You're both under arrest for attempted murder." Alton collapsed into the chair, covering his face with his hands. Prudence rushed to the door, but Howard blocked her way. I wouldn't advise it, he said calmly. Sorananikonon. Running away will only make things worse for you. You can't do that, Prudence shrieked, turning to me. We're family. Family? I grinned. Family doesn't try to kill each other for money. Family doesn't celebrate the death of a father. What would you do if the plan worked? Dance on my grave? It's all your own fault, Alton whispered without raising his head. You've always been a cruel, controlling tyrant. Mother was the only one who made life with you bearable. At the mention of Clarissa, something in me snapped. I felt my eyes fill with tears, for the first time since I discovered their conspiracy. Don't you dare talk about her, I whispered. Don't you dare use her memory to justify your meanness. She hated you too, Alton shouted. She only stayed with you because of me, to protect me from you. I shook my head, realizing this was a last desperate attempt to hurt me. Clarissa loved me to the very end, I said quietly, and she loved you. She would have been horrified if she'd known what you'd become. That seemed to strike a nerve with him. Alton jerked as if struck by a blow and raised his eyes to me with tears and fury. You know nothing, he shouted. You think you are always right, that you know everything better than anyone else. But you're wrong. You've been wrong about me all my life. Maybe, I agreed. But I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted you dead, even when you disappointed me. And you crossed a line that should never be crossed. At that moment, the sirens of police cars sounded outside the window. Prudence jerked once more toward the door, but Howard held her hand tightly. It's over, I said, looking at them both. You've lost. Alton laughed suddenly, a jerky, almost hysterical laugh. You know what's ironic? He asked. We're really in debt, up to our eyeballs. I've taken out loans, borrowed from loan sharks, all in the hope of getting rich quick. But all the investments have failed. Prudence is right. We did need your money. We have nowhere to go. That's your problem, I replied stiffly. You're a grown man, Alton. It's time you started taking responsibility for your actions. Don't you understand? His voice broke into a shout. I was never like you. I couldn't live by your rules. You made a loser out of me with your eternal pressure. No, I shook my head. You made that choice yourself. Every day of your life, you chose the path of least resistance, and that's where it got you. There was a knock at the door. Howard went to open it, and two uniformed police officers came in. They were followed by a detective in civilian clothes. Seamus Drummond? He asked, looking at me. I'm Detective Muldoon. We got a report of an attempted murder. Yes, I nodded. It's my son, Alton Drummond, and his wife, Prudence. I have all the evidence of their crime. The policeman approached Alton and Prudence. The detective began to read them their rights while the officers handcuffed them. As I watched my son and daughter-in-law being led out of the house, I felt a strange emptiness inside. No triumph at the retribution that had been accomplished. No bitterness at the final severing of the family bond. Just a deep, all-consuming weariness. You will regret it, Prudence shouted, looking over her shoulder. You're a lonely old man. No one will care for you. No one will come to your real funeral. I didn't answer. What could I say to a man who hated me so fiercely? A man who saw me only as an obstacle to wealth? Alton walked on in silence with his head down. Only at the door did he turn around. I hate you, he said quietly. I always have. And that was probably the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. When the police left, taking Alton and Prudence with them, Howard came over to me and put his hand on my shoulder. Are you all right? He asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We stood in the trashed living room of my house, amidst the traces of the memorial party, and were silent. What was there to say? I'll stay with you tonight, Howard decided. You shouldn't be alone right now. Thank you, friend, I finally said. Water money, but I'll be fine. It's not the first time I've been alone. He reluctantly agreed to leave, making me promise to call if I needed anything. When the door closed behind him, I sank slowly into my old chair and looked around the room. There were signs of the party everywhere. Empty bottles, dirty glasses, crumpled napkins. Someone had spilled wine on the carpet, leaving a dark red stain that looked like blood. Their stupid poster still hung on the wall. Onward to a new life. I tore it down and crumpled it up. But maybe there was a grain of truth in that slogan. Maybe I really should have moved on to a new life. A life without Alton, without constantly thinking about where I'd gone wrong as a father. I stood up and walked over to the fireplace where Clarissa's picture stood. She was smiling her soft smile, and I suddenly felt like she would understand me, understood and forgave me for all the mistakes I'd made raising our son. "We did the best we could," I whispered, touching the picture with my fingers. "The rest was his choice." The house was quiet, with only the clock on the wall ticking, the old mechanical clock that Clarissa loved for its reliability. Once this house had been full of life, laughter, love. Now it seemed an empty shell, a repository of bitter memories. Perhaps it was time for a change, for a new beginning. After all, I had survived my own death. What better reason to start living again? The next few days passed like a blur. I had to give numerous statements to the police, explaining my staged death and presenting evidence of Alton and Prudence's criminal scheme. Detective Muldoon, an elderly man with tired eyes who seemed to have seen every kind of human meanness, listened to my story with professional calm, only occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Do you realize that faking your own death and misleading law enforcement is a serious offense?" he asked when I had finished my story. "I understand," I nodded, "and I'm prepared to bear any punishment. But I had to have hard evidence. Otherwise, it was just word against word." Muldoon rubbed his chin, looking at the surveillance tapes and the pictures of the damaged brakes. "Given the circumstances," he said finally, "the prosecutor's office probably won't press charges against you. But I wouldn't advise you to repeat such experiments in the future." I grinned. I wasn't likely to get another chance to fake my own death. There weren't many relatives left who wanted to kill me. Alton and Prudence were arrested and placed in the detention center. They were charged with attempted murder and conspiracy to murder. The prosecutor, a young, energetic woman named Lorraine Dickens, said the case was ironclad and that both faced 25 years to life in prison. "Had they hired lawyers?" I asked her during our meeting. "Prudence used her one phone call to contact a lawyer," Lorraine replied. "Some cheap criminal lawyer. But your son—" She hesitated, not knowing how best to say it. "What?" I hurried her up. "Your son canceled the call. He said he had no one to call, and that he would plead guilty." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Even after everything that had happened, somewhere deep inside I still hoped that there was something human left in Alton, some spark of conscience or remorse. But his refusal to call and his admission of guilt sounded not like remorse, but like surrender, like the final act of desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. "Do you want to meet him?" Lorraine asked. "I can arrange it." I thought long and hard about this proposal. What could I say to the man who tried to kill me? What could he say to me to explain his actions in any way? But in the end, curiosity and perhaps the last vestiges of paternal feeling took over. "Yes," I said, "I want to see him again." The meeting was scheduled for the next day in the visiting room of the detention center. I arrived early, tapping my fingers nervously on the table as I waited for Alton to be brought in. When the door finally opened and the guards ushered him in, I barely recognized my own son. In just a few days of confinement, it was as if he had aged 10 years. His face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes and more gray in his hair. He sat across from me, staring at the table and avoiding my gaze. The guards moved toward the door, leaving us as alone as possible in this situation. "How are you?" I asked, unable to find any other words to start the conversation. Alton looked up, and in his eyes I saw a strange calmness, almost humility. "How do you think?" He answered a question with a question. "I'm accused of trying to kill my own father. I'm facing life in prison. My wife in the next block is trying to pin the blame on me. How can I be?" I remained silent, not knowing what to say. We sat in silence. Two strangers, bound only by blood and mutual pain. "Why have you come?" Alton asked at last. "Do you want to see me behind bars? Make sure that justice is done?" "No," I shook my head. "I wanted to understand. Why? Why now? Why not just wait for me to die naturally?" Alton grinned bitterly. "Money," he said simply. "It's always about money, don't you know? I'm up to my ears in debt. The creditors threatened to break my legs if I didn't pay them off by the end of the year. And Prudence. She was never satisfied with what we had, always wanted more, better, more expensive. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he'd learned from me as a child. After your stroke, we thought the end was near, that we just had to wait a little longer. But you pulled through, and you looked so healthy, so, durable. And time was running out. So you decided to speed things up, I finished for him. Yes, he nodded. First the meds. When that didn't work, the brakes. It was Prudence's idea, actually. She'd read somewhere that accidents due to brake failure were rarely investigated thoroughly, especially if the victim was an elderly person with a history of medical problems. As I listened to him, a deep sense of sadness grew inside. Not anger, not disgust, just an infinite sadness at the realization that my son, my flesh and blood, could plan my death in such cold blood. You know what's ironic? Alton continued. If you had really died, we would have gotten a big surprise. I'm sure you changed your will, didn't you? We wouldn't have gotten anything. Tabitha would have gotten most of it, I confirmed. The rest would have gone to charity. Alton nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. She was always your favorite, not even your own daughter, but a niece, closer than your own son. There was a lingering resentment in his voice, almost childlike in its naivete. It was as if he were still the little boy who didn't understand why his father was never satisfied with his success. I loved you, Alton, I said quietly. I just didn't know how to show it. After your mother died, I shut down. I didn't know how to be a father without her. She was a buffer between us, a translator from my language to yours. It's too late for that kind of talk, don't you think? He lowered his eyes again. What's done is done. I'll spend the rest of my life behind bars, and you can live your life knowing that your son is a murderer, or a failed murderer. We're silent again. Outside the window of the visitation room, we could see a patch of blue Arizona sky, so bright and free that the contrast with our situation seemed almost mocking. I won't apologize to you, Alton finally said. I really wanted you dead. And if things had turned out differently if you hadn't exposed us, I'd have no qualms about spending your money. His honesty was almost refreshing after all the years of innuendo and pretense. I won't apologize to you for the kind of father I've been either, I replied. I did what I thought was right. I may have been wrong, but I never wished you harm. That was the end of our conversation. We told each other everything we could say, revealed all the cards. There were no tears, no dramatic declarations of love, no promises to keep in touch. Just a quiet acceptance that our paths had finally parted. When I walked out of the detention center, I felt strangely relieved, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I was no longer the father responsible for my son. I was just a man who could finally live his life without looking back on unfulfilled hopes and disappointments. A week later, the preliminary hearing was held. Alton, as promised, pleaded guilty. Prudence, on the other hand, hired a well-known Tucson lawyer and decided to fight, claiming that she had been a pawn in her husband's hands, that he had manipulated and threatened her. No one believed her. The judge set bail at $1 million for Alton and $800,000 for Prudence. Of course, they didn't have that kind of money, and they remained in custody until the trial. I didn't participate in the trial directly. My testimony was recorded and introduced as evidence, but I didn't have to appear in the courtroom and face them again. I was grateful for that. One meeting with Alton in the detention center was enough to close that chapter of my life. On the day of sentencing, I still went to court, not out of a desire to see them led away in handcuffs, but more out of a sense of duty. I had to be present for the final act of this tragedy I had witnessed and participated in. The trial was brief. Alton received 25 years with the possibility of parole in 15. Prudence got 20 years with the possibility of parole in 12. She sobbed as the sentence was read. Alton remained calm, only casting one last long look at me before he was led away. I walked out of the courthouse with a sense of finality. The end of the story had been written, the curtain had fallen. Now something new could begin. The first thing I did was go to Howard to finalize my will. My entire estate now went to Tabitha, with small amounts to charity and a few memorabilia for old friends. Alton was completely excluded from the document. Not even a token dollar I decided not to leave. Are you sure? Howard asked, looking at me over his glasses. This is the final breakup. The breakup happened when he decided to kill me, I answered. Now I'm just putting it on paper. Tabitha was distraught when she heard about my decision. Uncle Seamus, I can't accept all this, she said. It's too much. I don't have anyone else, I replied simply, and you deserve it more than anyone else. You were there for me when I needed help, without asking for anything in return. After all the legal formalities, I returned home and sat in my chair for a long time, thinking about the future. The house suddenly seemed too big, too empty, too full of memories, both good and bad. Maybe Prudence was right about at least one thing. This house really was an old people's home, steeped in the past. The next day, I called the realtor and put the house on the market. The decision came surprisingly easily. I no longer felt attached to these walls, to this place. I wanted something new, fresh, without the ghosts of the past. While the realtor was looking for buyers, I began to sort through my belongings. A lot of things went to charities, some went in the trash, and the most valuable and memorable things went in boxes for moving. As I was sorting through an old dresser, I came across a scrapbook of photos. Clarissa had always been a big fan of capturing every moment of our lives. I sat down on the floor, as I had once sat as a child, and began flipping through the pages. Here was our wedding. Clarissa in a simple white dress, me in a simple suit, both of us so young and hopeful. Here is Alton's birth, a tiny bundle in the hands of a happy mother. Here are his first steps, first day of school, graduation. In these early photos, Alton was always smiling, wide open, childishly sincere. When did that change? When did his gaze become wary, his smile fake? I tried to remember a specific moment, some point of no return, but I couldn't. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible, until one day I found my son looking at me as if I were the enemy. I closed the album, feeling a lump in my throat. What would Clarissa say if she saw what our family had come to? She had always believed in the best in people, always hoped that love and patience could overcome any hardship. Would she have been disappointed in me? In Alton? In both of us? I carefully placed the album in the box of things I planned to take with me. You can't change the past, but you can accept it and move on. The house sold faster than I expected, to a young couple with 2 kids who were thrilled with the spacious yard and proximity to a good school. Looking at them while signing the papers, I felt a strange calmness. This house would be filled with new voices, new stories, new memories, and it felt right. With the money from the sale of the house and the solid savings I had accumulated over the years, I could afford to start a whole new life. After much deliberation, I decided to move to San Diego, a city Clarissa had always dreamed of, but where we had never visited together. I loved the idea of living by the ocean, waking up to the sound of the waves, spending sunsets on the beach. I bought a small house on the outskirts of town, close enough to the ocean that I could hear its noise on particularly quiet nights. The house was modern, bright, with a minimum of furniture and a maximum of space. The exact opposite of my old place in Tucson. On moving day, Tabitha came over to help with the final preparations. We stood on the porch of the new house, watching the sunset over the ocean. "How are you feeling?" "But," she asked, watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon. "Free," I answered, and it was the plain truth. For the first time in a long time, I felt really free. She smiled and hugged me tightly. "I'm happy for you, Uncle Seamus. You deserve this." In my new home, in my new town, I began to discover things I had always put off for later. I signed up for art classes. Clarissa always said I had talent, but I never took the time to develop it. I started going for walks along the ocean shore, sometimes stopping to talk to fishermen or just to watch the seagulls. I joined a local chess club and discovered that my analytical mind, honed by years of engineering, was perfectly suited to the game. Sometimes at night, lying in bed listening to the sound of the waves, I thought of Altona. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I still felt the pain of his betrayal, of our relationship ending in such a disastrous way. But every day that pain grew duller, more detached, like an old wound that had finally begun to heal. I didn't forgive him. I don't think I could ever fully forgive attempted murder. But I was beginning to accept my share of responsibility for our relationship getting to this point. I had been too strict, too demanding, too focused on his shortcomings and too stingy with praise. I created an atmosphere where my son felt like a perpetual failure, perpetually not good enough. It didn't excuse his actions, but it helped me understand their origins. And in that understanding was its own kind of healing. In my new home, in my new life, I finally found what I'd been missing all those years after Clarissa's death. Peace and acceptance. Acceptance of the past with all its mistakes and disappointments. Acceptance of the present with its unexpected joys and discoveries. And acceptance of the future, unknown but full of possibilities. I was no longer the father of an ungrateful son or a widower clinging to memories. I was simply Seamus Drummond, a man who, at 72, had found the strength to start over. And that, perhaps, was the sweetest revenge for Alton and Prudence. I lived a full, rich life while they spent their days behind bars, counting the years until their eventual release. They wanted me dead, but instead I found a new life. And that was the best ending to our sad story.